Hello, everyone. I'm Gia Pace, Public Programs Coordinator at the Museum of Jewish Heritage, a living memorial to the Holocaust. It is my pleasure to welcome you to today's program with Menachem Kaiser and Stephanie Butnick. We are here to discuss Menachem's new book, Plunder, a memoir of family property and Nazi treasure, which was just released last week. The book is the story of his quest to reclaim his family's apartment building in Poland and the astonishment entanglement with Nazi treasure hunters that follows. You can order your copy at the link in the Zoom chat, which I'll put in there in just a moment. Menachem Kaiser is a writer in Brooklyn, New York. He holds an MFA in creative writing from the University of Michigan and was a Fulbright Fellow to Lithuania. His writing has appeared in the Wall Street Journal, The Atlantic, and elsewhere. Menachem is in conversation today with Stephanie Butnick, the deputy editor at Tablet Magazine and the co-host of leading Jewish podcast, Unorthodox. Feel free to share questions in the Zoom Q&A box anytime during the discussion. We'll try to get to all your questions. And without further ado, welcome Menachem and Stephanie.
Gia, thank you so much. And thanks to the Museum of Jewish Heritage. It's always a treat to do these Zoom events for the museum's audience. And I want to thank everyone who tuned in tonight. I don't know if you know this, but tonight is actually the White House Seder that Douglas Emhoff is hosting. So you could have been there tonight, but you're here instead. And because you're here, you actually can't go there. You can't like leave now and sign up. So I appreciate it. Welcome to everyone. And Menachem Kaiser, it is great to be here with you.
It's so nice to be here. Thanks, Stephanie, and thank you, Gia.
So we are here tonight to discuss this truly fascinating, riveting book. And, you know, you read family property. I was sort of expecting like, you know, a family restitution saga, maybe a little drama. I was not expecting like tunnels full of Nazi gold and like the craziest bureaucratic, like just insanity, and just really the sort of fast pace of this book and sort of the thriller angle of it. So we'll get to all of that tonight. Everyone will know. We'll sort of get all their questions answered. I'm going to talk to you for a little bit. You're going to read a few passages. Our wonderful attendees tonight can pop questions in the Q&A. Oh, someone says the Seder's already over, so it's fine. We're getting the after party, the after hours crowd from the Seder, the spillover crowd, which we are happy to have. So if you have questions for Menachem, pop them in the QA box. We'll get to them at the end. So Menachem, tell us where you were at the start of this project when you first started thinking about your grandfather's legacy.
Sure. I went to Poland really for no reasons that had anything to do with family history in 2011. And while I was there, my father, you know, he gave me an address that belonged to my grandfather. And I'll mention that I never knew my grandfather and was really never all that curious about him. It was just sort of like an easy, comfortable ignorance. But when I was in Poland, I felt a certain obligation, like a kind of etiquette, to go visit his hometown. And so my father like rummaged through some papers and called me back a couple hours later and he gave me an address and I went. And at that point, I had no reason to think I would ever return. I felt like I had fulfilled my memory obligation, if you will. But like over the next couple of years, I ended up spending quite a bit of time in Poland, meeting a lot of people and developing a kind of network. And my father kept mentioning that he had these papers. And he said, you know, we have these documents that my grandfather owned the building and you know, I never really did anything with them, but take a look, da, 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 da. He kept nudging me and it took me 4 years till I actually got the papers. And then when I went through those documents, and that was in 2015, it was kind of a revelation. I feel like I met my grandfather for the first time. I saw like the first kind of thing that defined his personality. I saw like 30 years of frustration on his end, trying to reclaim the property and getting nowhere. And at that point, I decided, you know, this seems like an interesting way in to explore questions that I was interested in concerning memory, contemporary Poland, Holocaust memory. And so I initiated a claim in 2015 to try and get the building back.
So we will get to everything that happened after. There's a really nice passage on page 6 that I'd love for you to, I feel like we're at the Seder already. Menachem, on page 6, you're next, Dayenu. Just that tells us a little bit about, sets this whole story up in a really nice way, if you don't mind reading.
From We Knew, right, Stephanie?
Yeah.
Okay. We knew that my grandfather was the only one in his family to have survived the war, that his parents and his siblings had been murdered, as was nearly all of his large extended family. But as knowledge, this was dark matter. We knew nothing about his pre-war or intra-war life. We didn't know which concentration camps he had been in or what his father had done for a living. We knew nothing about his parents, aunts, uncles, cousins. My father and his two siblings, let alone my generation, would be hard pressed to tell you the names of my grandfather's siblings. They wouldn't even be entirely sure of the number. We knew they had died, but we had no idea who they were. We did not know where they died or how they died. And so when my grandfather died, they died another sort of death. I went to Poland for the first time in 2010 for reasons that had nothing to do with family history. I just finished a research fellowship in Lithuania and was spending Rosh Hashanah in Krakow. But once I was there, I felt I should go to my grandparents' hometowns. It seemed like something I should do, less an obligation, really, than etiquette. When you're in town, you visit your relatives and say hi. When you're in Toronto on your grandfather's yahrzeit, you go to his grave and say psalms. When you're in Poland for the first time, you make the trip to your grandparents' hometowns and take pictures. You go, and for the rest of your life, you can say you have been there.
Thank you. So I have did a similar thing. I spent a summer in Krakow and I took a day trip to Zawiercie, which is where my father's father was from. And I sort of did the thing that you described, that a lot of children and grandchildren of Holocaust survivors and also people whose family are rooted in somewhere in, Eastern Europe. So you described this as memory tourism. Can you tell us what exactly you mean by that?
Yeah, I was sort of using this, the term and the concept of memory tourism as like people like us who are sort of going back to, the Heimland, of places they've never been, but are still sort of firmly established in their legends or their sense of history. And so, I had never been to Sosnowiec. No one in my family had ever been to Sosnowiec, but in a sense, it's kind of, where I'm from. And that's a kind of a place and a kind of coming home to that I was really interested in and really wrestling with and sort of investigating what that means. And like the sort of I'm a tourist to this place, but I'm not a regular tourist because I'm not really that all that interested in like the restaurant, so to speak, or the sites. I'm interested in my particular story. And so it's sort of there's like a layer on top of the place that I'm more interested in, which is its memory. And it sort of gets really tricky to start talking about that. Like, how does that memory interact with the physical geographical place? And like, I got more and more interested in exploring those questions.
It is funny, and you're right. The question is not what is this place, but what is the meaning of this place, which is a very like fifth song. That's also very, very much of the singer. But it's true. You go to these places and you want some kind of reckoning with them. You want to understand how you relate to them, because I've always felt it so strange. When I was in Poland, I called my my paternal grandfather's sister, who was at that point the only remaining Holocaust survivor left in our family. She has since passed away, and I called her and I said, I'm in Krakow. I'm gonna go to Zawiercie, and she said, "Watch your pocketbook." And I was sort of like, "Oh, actually, it's very different to come from a place where your family actually doesn't really necessarily want anything to do with." I mean, what did your family think about when you sort of started the bureaucracy, the process of restitution that we'll get to? I mean, what did they think? Would your grandfather have wanted to do this? I mean, would anyone have wanted you back there?
It's a good question. One of the things I really struggle with is trying to sort of relate to what my grandfather wanted. Like I never knew him, and like what his desires and his fears and his sense of leaving Poland very permanently were never really articulated to me. And so like I sort of struggle, but also sort of really hold firm to my ignorance. And I'm like, I don't know, and I'm not going to know. With my more immediate family, I think there was a kind of bemusement for a while. Like again, we didn't really have that sense of return passed down. Like three of my four grandparents were Holocaust survivors, and it was obviously a big part of my identity, but it was a completely undetailed part. There was never any emphasis on their story because none of us really knew it. And so the idea of going back to Poland was something that's just like that was viewed as nice, but by no means an obligation. And so like I started spending a lot of time there and then started doing these legal battles to reclaim the family property. And there was a sense of like, this is interesting and potentially something, but there was, I would say for a few years, a kind of bemusement, like, let's see how this plays out.
So let's get into the process that you picked up that your grandfather had tried to initiate earlier, but he was sort of stymied by not sending the wrong form when the government opened up these restitution claims. Can you tell us a little bit about what that was like? And then there's a passage I really want you to read about the very Kafkaesque quest to get your grandfather's certainly murdered relatives declared legally dead.
Sure. So let me specify. So my case is not a restitution claim exactly. So in Poland, it's one of the only, I think one of the only, or maybe the only country in Eastern Europe that doesn't actually have any restitution laws. So if a property was taken or nationalized, there are no legal mechanisms to get it back. My claim, on the other hand, was a relatively straightforward inheritance claim. So basically what we were saying to the courts is my great-grandfather, this guy Moshe Kaiser, he owned the building before the war, and he's still the legal owner. And so we were trying to update the registry. Right now, if you sort of look in the online and look at the deed, it's technically ownerless. So there really isn't a disputation as to who owns the building. We were just saying, update the registry, and then my family, sort of that tree should get established within the Polish courts. So Moshe Kaiser died, it should be passed to his son, and then he died, it should be passed to his children, and et cetera. And so I had sort of these two tracks. And the first track was sort of establishing the deaths of everyone who had died in the Holocaust. So there were no records at all. There were no death certificates. We had no details as to where they died or how they died or when they died. And this proved to be trickier than I had imagined. So to put into context, my great-grandparents were born in the 1880s, so they'd be between 130 and 140 years old at the time I was doing this claim. And so I sort of thought that would be a relatively simple procedure, and it turned out to be really complicated. And I'll go there was a lot of twists and turns along the way in terms of did we file the right claim? Turns out there's two kinds of death declaration within the Polish court system. But yeah, nothing went simply from the start.
So will you sort of give us a taste of this on page 98?
Yeah, this is from the argument.
Yeah.
I'll just let me reference my my lawyer is I refer to her as the killer throughout the book, so that's who it is in this paragraph. The argument the killer prepared for the court was one of common sense, that what was plainly real should be acknowledged as bureaucratically real. The only relevant document we had was a 1967 affidavit from Rabbi A.J. Englard, friend of my grandfather's, stating that he had known the Kaisers in Sosnowiec and that only my grandfather had survived, which was something, but in terms of evidence, not much. Because Englard doesn't say how he knows they died. He could be, and in all likelihood was, repeating hearsay, or whatever you'd call the undetailed knowledge of the deaths of Holocaust victims. We had no concentration camp lists, no testimony that they were in this camp or that they died there. Extensive searches of databases of Holocaust victims and survivors turned up nothing.
And so someone's actually asking if you are an attorney, but you are not an attorney, as far as I know. You're a writer.
I'm not an attorney. No.
And you engage the killer, who's someone in Krakow tells you, like, this is the person to go to. And so what kind of process does she sort of embark on your behalf?
Right. So the first thing was establishing the deaths of my dead relatives. And so basically we were doing for my great-grandfather and his brother, who were co-owners of the building. And so the case actually got split into two different jurisdictions based on the last known addresses. And so there was a court case in Będzin, which is the adjacent city to Sosnowiec. And that one, the judge, it kind of sailed through. The judge never called me for a hearing. We got the death certificates or the death declarations very easily. And then in Sosnowiec, we applied to have my great-grandparents and his two other children, aside from my grandfather, declared as dead, and we lost. The judge said no, and I had a really hard time understanding why. But at that point, I had lost all the generosity I had come in with, and it really felt like they were out to get me. And we appealed to the regional court, which was one court lower than the Supreme Court, and we lost again. And at that point, I was sort of beside myself. I really had sort of got pulled back into the attitude I had grown up with towards Poles. And then I found out that we had actually filed the wrong claim. So it turns out there was two kinds of death declarations. One is for if you could sort of know where and when the person died. And according to those criteria, they didn't actually technically get it. Now it becomes a question if the judge could have been more generous. Yeah, the judge could have been more generous, but it wasn't the same as sort of out to get me. It was like more of a lack of generosity. And so we have to file the other claim, which is more like a missing person after X amount of time will be declared dead. So we have to start from scratch at that point.
And this involves like taking out a newspaper ad,
Yeah.
asking if anyone's seen this person who was born in the the
Yeah,
late 1800s.
Yeah, it sounds really silly, on some level it is, but to me, I'm still sort of clinging to that generosity of bureaucracies will be bureaucratic. And so like, I don't know what the process is in Canada, let's say, or where I'm from, but like these things, their laws are going to be kind of strange, and taxing, no matter where you are. And so the question is like, I never really felt the judge was really not generous. Did I ever feel like anyone was out to get me? Not really. And so a more difficult question was like, is there something systemic, sort of like built into the system, even if everyone is well-intentioned, that's going to stymie efforts like mine? And that I think the answer is yes. Like why there should be a law that would help this move along, but there wasn't. I was like, and so the Holocaust is just this enormous rupture in continuity, and like the legal system has a really hard time handling it. So again, even if all the actors, all the judges and the lawyers and the clerks, everyone's like, working in good faith, you could still just encounter tremendous amount of frustration.
It's funny, when I was in Xavierge, I had my translator take me to the city, the archive, and it was like out of Monty Python. She just like didn't have the files for a period of years between 1939 and 1945. And so I think that it is really interesting, but you're really part of this. There's this trope, right, of Americans or Jews coming back to these countries. Obviously, everything was very murky during the war. There's a lot of just sort of ambiguity there, right? Let's stay on that generous note. I mean, the idea of like a Jewish kid knocking on your door and saying like, this was my house, this is my grandfather's house, that's sort of like almost like a boogeyman now in certain European countries, it feels like. So do you feel like were you conscious of that while you were on this, when you were meeting the people who lived in the building you thought this was?
Yeah, I was hyper conscious of that. I think initially I had gone in again with this sort of default attitude of like what was my family remains my family, and like not really being conscientious or even really giving any thought whatsoever to the people who live in the building now. And then over the next couple of years, I encountered quite a bit of pushback, on what I was doing, this reclamation, and people were accusing me of appropriation or being insensitive, and it really rankled. I really had a hard time with some of these accusations, and ultimately, like it did move the needle. Like I did relent somewhat, and not to say that my moral or legal right is compromised. I had a very hard time sort of expecting that. I was like, the counterfactual. If my family hadn't been murdered, my family would still own the building. So like that claim to me was sort of preposterous on its face. But the idea of sort of complexifying the narrative and sort of like recognizing that these people have lives, that the building has a narrative that is not just my family's. And so I got more and more uncomfortable with sort of taking over property without any knowledge of who lives there. And so I sort of worked up the courage and knocked on the door. And the first few people I knocked on basically slammed it in my face. And they were older, and they see a foreigner. I came with like a photographer and a translator, and they were very, very suspicious. And but if, then I did meet people who were just unbelievably generous and open, and sort of shared with me like their life story, the story of the building. And initially I had lied. I'm not proud of it, but I had felt too ashamed to come in there and tell the truth. I sort of made up this ridiculous story about being like a researcher, and it was all technically true, but really a lie. But I relented. I said I couldn't keep that up. I felt too ashamed, and so I told them the truth, and we developed real relationships, and that took over 2 years. I've really spent quite a bit of time with some of them, and then I found out, spoiler, that I was in the wrong building. Like that there was a typo.
The first big twist in the book.
Yeah. So there was like a typo in one of the documents, and like the real building was down the block. And, that one, I won't spoil for you what happens, but I sort of had to reface this moral quandary of like, and sort of really take stock of like, if I had the energy and like the fortitude to go into another building and do this from scratch. And like, it's really hard. I think we like, from a distance, you read these stories and it sounds like an adventure. But when you're in people's faces and like even if everyone's being generous, you're still like at the base talking about people's homes. It's really hard. It was just really taxing. But to answer your question, yeah, the trope is a common one. There's been national elections, which it's been an issue, the idea of reclamation. There's a tremendous amount of Jewish property that's been given back to the Jewish community. And there's a lot of private property that has not. And so we're not, when you're sort of in Poland and dealing with these things, the war doesn't feel all that far out. That's the thing. It's like, in the US, it does feel more distant, really. But when you have like an actual building that belonged to someone, that narrative is like a lot leaner.
No, it's true. I mean, the thing that I was most moved by when I did my day trip, before, obviously did not spend as much time there as you ended up, but when I was in Sosnowiec, there was a cemetery groundsman. Like there was someone whose job it was, a non-Jewish Pole, to just sort of keep the cemetery up, keep it up. And I showed up with my translator, and he was so excited to. I mean, I don't know the last time someone went to visit. I mean, it sounds like someone who here is in this chat who does has a whole Facebook group for this whole area, this whole region of Poland. But he was so excited that someone finally he could like understand the connection of like this place to a real living person. And so I do think there's like that weird generosity too. But something I'm struck by is just, this is an emotional journey for you, right? You don't know your grandfather, you're going back, but you're actually tied up in red tape. Like what you're doing is actually submitting forms. You're not doing, like, it doesn't feel super emotional, does it?
That's an interesting question. I had this, I don't know. And like, that's a really honest answer, because again, I didn't have a relationship with my grandfather. And so I didn't know him, and I knew almost nothing about him. I don't know his Holocaust story, and I have only the vaguest idea of what he was actually like. And so what I really, throughout this whole, the whole story and the book, it's like struggle to articulate that meaning. And it's there, but it is very hard to articulate because it's not a personal relationship exactly. But like, yet I'm sort of reaching, I'm reaching for the memory of him, and like I'm not quite getting there, but the reaching to me is significant in and of itself.
And so while you're doing this reaching for this grandfather who you didn't know, you actually you uncover a relative that you did not know existed. And that gets us into sort of the other half of the memoir, which is really, I mean, fantastic. It is truly hard to believe. Can you tell us about Abraham Kaiser?
Sure. In order to explain Abraham Kaiser, I have to tell everyone about Nazi tunnels. And so there's these 7 Nazi tunnels, 7 underground complexes built by the Nazis using mostly Jewish slave labor towards the end of the war. These things are called Project Riza. They're in Silesia, which is in the southwest part of the country, kind of centered around a town called Wałbrzych. And none of them are completed, but some of them are closer to completion. Those ones are enormous. We're talking square kilometers, 20-meter high walls. And I could show a photo, if that's okay, Stephanie.
It's truly something I had never heard of. It seems.
And so here's Sabon, which was one of the smaller ones. This one is not open to the public. These A-frames are original from the war. I will also want to credit Jason Francisco with taking these photographs. And so this is this is in Osówka, which is one of the finished ones. It is open to the public. And you could kind of get a sense of what it was going to become. That's reinforced concrete. Here you could see the 2 tunnel system. These were like layers. And to give you a sense of scale, this ceiling I think is like 20 meters tall. So these were really enormous structures. Let me get out of here. Anyways, so the Nazis, using Jewish labor, built these tunnels. And what's very sort of strange and enigmatic about them is that there is virtually no primary documentation. So we have no sort of documentary evidence as to what the Germans were planning to do with them. Now, let me explain one more quick thing before we get to Abraham Kaiser. Sort of surrounding these tunnels is a very large subculture of so-called treasure hunters who are very obsessed with all things mystery. And so we have things like anything that's unanswered. anything unexplained, particularly that pertains to World War II. And these guys, and it's a very big community. The numbers, you could have like up to 100,000 people go out with metal detectors. And it's a very wide range of men, and it's mostly men. You have one end, just the guys with like metal detectors, you have another end, very sophisticated, even sometimes sponsored expeditions. And so at the center of this, like what they call culture of mystery, are these tunnels. And they are obsessed. And so these tunnels, they got a little bit famous in 2015 when two of these so-called treasure hunters announced to the world that they had found the so-called golden train, which is a ostensibly legendary train full of looted Nazi gold that the Nazis had taken from Wrocław. It was on the way to Berlin. It got rooted into a mountain and it was buried there. And people have been talking about this train for 40 years. And a few years ago, these two guys said they found it, and the world took them very seriously. So you had like the New York Times, the New Yorker, BBC, Fox News, Sky. Everyone descended on this little town of Wałbrzych, and they became very renowned for a few months. Now, here's where Abraham Kaiser comes in. Basically, because there is no primary documentation, there is a memoir written by a man named Abraham Kaiser, which was he was a slave laborer on in these camps. And after he survived, and after the war, he borrowed a bicycle from the woman who saved him and went around to each of the camps collecting these scraps. He assembled them and brought them to an editor, and it was published as a diary in the early 60s in Poland. And this diary, this memoir, which translates as Behind the Wires of Death, has become like a near sacred text among the treasure hunter community because of its details of the tunnels. And so I would meet guys who like have read it 40 times. I'd meet people who have followed his pilgrimage from camp to camp. He's accorded like really a kind of reverence. It's really kind of amazing. And where I come in is, I was just heard about the Golden Train, and I was just like, this sounds weird. I had never heard of any of this before, like you, Stephanie. And I was like, this feels really compelling. I was doing an MFA at the time in fiction. So I was like, this sounds like fruitful material. So I reached out to a guide and said, could you take me for a couple of days and just show me this? I had no intention of like anything familial at all. And then she took me, and then I met some of the treasure hunters, and they brought me to some of the tunnels, and it broke my brain. It was really kind of astonishing. And then afterwards, we were just sitting and having a beer. And then, we were just having like a really fun talk, like really light talk. They were talking about things they found. They were talking about their day jobs, their treasure collections. And then at a certain point, my friend Maya Ip, who was with me and who has a lot more chutzpah than I do, she asked a much more difficult question. She's like, this is all really cool and macho, but what do you do about the fact that like all these Jews died digging these tunnels? Because, they're all very cool, the tunnels, but a tremendous amount of Jews, about 14,000 Jews died as slave laborers. And at that point, they got really sort of agitated. They started speaking very quickly in Polish, and I don't speak Polish. So I was just kind of waiting patiently for it to be translated. But while I was just letting the Polish wash over me, I kept hearing my last name. And they didn't know my last name, so they weren't referring to me. And so while they were at a certain point, I just kept hearing Kaiser. So I actually paused them. I said, what's up? Who's this Kaiser? And they said, Abraham Kaiser. You don't know who he is? I mean, he's this great Jewish survivor. He wrote this diary, and they explained to me who he was. I never heard of him. And then I ended up buying his book. And because of the legal work I had done with the building, I had built out a family tree and realized that Abraham was my grandfather's closest surviving relative. He was his first cousin, which was, in my family, kind of a seismic shift in our understanding of who had survived. And so like it went from extinct to not extinct. Like no one in my family had ever heard of him. And then, at that point, I sort of fell into the world of the treasure hunters. They really sort of took to me. They really embraced me. They were so excited to have a kin of Abraham Kaiser. They sort of went with the story that I was his grandfather, that I was his grandson, rather. At a certain point, I stopped correcting them. And so, I really went down that rabbit hole.
And so, I mean, this is where like the mind-bending part of this whole book starts. It all is. But so in addition to finding this world of treasure hunters, you also find more family members, right? Like you connect with his descendants.
Yeah, so Abraham had a wife and a son before the war. They were killed in Auschwitz. And but Abraham survived. And after the war, he eventually, there's a brief period which there's a pretty wild story, and he sort of stays with the woman who saved him for a few years. But afterwards, he immigrated to Israel, and his sister had moved to Israel before the war. And so Abraham got remarried, but he didn't have any children. But his sister Necha had two daughters, one of whom is still alive, and both of them have children. And I met almost everyone in that branch. And there's also a brother named Chaskel. He went to Argentina before the war, and he grew up. He had four kids. Some of them are still alive. I'm seeing one of them next week, actually. He lives in Miami. And so, yeah, I got to meet a whole new branch of the family.
So we're already getting questions from people who are demanding to know, did you reclaim this property? I'm not going to ask you that because I don't want to actually give away a big part of the book, and also because in so many ways it's ultimately besides the point. So I want to know how your conception of who you are, where and who you come from. I mean, how did that change by the end of the story? I mean, the story as it ends in the book, obviously, things may have continued since then.
It's a good question. The way I've come to understand it is that it's sort of the reverse of a lot of people's stories. As a lot of people sort of they have a really firm idea of what they're going after, and then they either get it or don't get it. And so either they feel like they have redemption or failure. I had this I thought I was new. I have sort of an earned ignorance. I didn't even understand the questions I was trying to ask before I spent 5 years trying this and then trying to write a book about it, and then sort of ending with nothing concrete, but sort of the material in order to articulate those questions. And so I have nothing satisfying to offer except my own frustration, which I hope is rings truer than a neat linear ending.
I mean, towards the end of the book, you really break the I don't know if you can break the fourth wall in a memoir, but you kind of do, because you sort of speak to directly to this idea of the literary genre of grandchild goes back, and you sort of pushed back against the idea that all stories should be buttoned up. And you also expressed almost an enviousness of people whose stories were easier than yours, right? Who grew up here, who knew, first of all, the details.
Yeah.
And also who could start you sort of started ahead of you, and then also got there, they're happy in whatever kind of happy closure ending you could get.
Yeah. In a way, I feel very lucky, actually. I started in a story that felt familiar. Here's this building, I'm going to go get it back, and I'm going to either do it or I'm going to fail. And to me, that was a very familiar arc, and it felt very easy. But as it sort of slipped away from me, and I started making mistake after mistake, and errors and things that were my fault or my lawyer's fault or no one's fault, and I was just a typo. There was just so many of those. The story became unfamiliar. But I do think it became truer. It started becoming much, much richer. And I sort of it forced me to interrogate the meaning of what I was doing. And so when I started, the building just felt like this prize, this thing I was going to reach for and maybe get it. But as that slipped away, all of a sudden, the building as a symbol became a much, much trickier question. And I feel weirdly grateful for not having an easy path, because otherwise I just let's say it took 2 weeks for an extreme counter example. What would that mean then? I don't know. I guess it'd be a good dinner table story, but I certainly wouldn't have been able to sort of probe the way I have.
Yeah, it wouldn't have been a book that is sort of a nice book length. It might have been a short story.
It would have been a pamphlet at best.
Yeah, you write something in that same passage that I found very compelling and a little bit surprising, and I'm going to read it to you and then ask you about it. You write, there can be no completion, redemption, catharsis, because our stories are not extensions of our grandparents' stories, are not sequels. We do not continue their stories, we act upon them, we consecrate, we plunder. And of course, this book is called Plunder, and you sort of understand the connection to the Nazi treasure side of things, but it's so fascinating to me, you're indicting us, right, for plundering these legacies in our own way. So what do you mean by that?
I think I've grown up with these stories. I think they become very, very familiar, of people sort of dipping into their Holocaust legacy, and then our age, our demographic, our generation sort of telling those stories. And I've always been very uneasy with that. And as in like, part of it again is like sort of that jealousy that like I never knew my grandparents. I don't know their story. I can't actually access it. I certainly can't make meaning out of it. And I can't build on it. But I do think there's there can often be in these types of stories a lack of awareness of that void. And I think we sort of, yeah, I would stand by that statement. Like, our stories are not sequels. Our stories are our own, and they'll be as meaningful as they are. But there's like a real unknowable void between like what we experience and what the memory we're trying to access. And I think everyone knows that intuitively, but I think sometimes in some of these books and films and television shows, it's a little, it gets a little too close and a little too familiar, and it threatens to cheapen the experience.
No, I mean, that insight to me is just really, really profound. And I think a lot of us do feel like we are answering like there's some question, but what was interesting to me is your family sort of goes along for this ride with you to a point, right? And then they sort of trying to tell you this, like they are a little bit uncomfortable by your journey at a certain point, aren't they?
I think there was real distance. I think there was like, this place was sort of locked away. And I think this notion of Poland was like more story than actual country. And so the idea of actually doing legal work on the ground there was
For a very long time.
a really long time. I didn't know how long it would take when I started, but I think it was like it was a strange undertaking. And so, everyone was supportive. I wouldn't for sure throughout. I didn't encounter any resistance, but certainly I don't think people took it seriously. And maybe on some level, I didn't take it seriously either, until it became a lot more tangible. And then, the book in a weird way sort of supersedes the story. And so like, there's a book about it now. So they run along parallel tracks, the actual reclamation and then a book about the reclamation. And so the book exists. So people read it and like, it's about their family. I mean, within my family at least. And yeah, people are having their reactions. And so far it's been very gratifying.
So we have a great question from Emil, who wants to know how your efforts to reclaim this apartment, your grandfather's apartment building, how did it shape your relationship with your own father?
I think it was again, I think it took a while for my father to understand how real it was. And then I think he ended up being really grateful. And I think there was like a connection where like it sort of opened a new channel between us. And he didn't in his wildest imagination, I don't think he ever saw this happening. And I think he's very proud of sort of like his legacy being, I'm trying to word like what's the good version of exploited? like celebrated,
Probed,
probed, and sort of plumbed and sort of like
mind.
Yeah, like something was created, even if the building wasn't reclaimed or something, like something was created out of it. And there's like, I think he's very happy about that. But yeah, relationships are complicated, but commemorated, someone says, Sam Handelman said.
But it's not really commemorate. I mean, it's like you're using it as source material almost, right? Depending on what version you go to. But yeah, I mean, it's this idea, like it goes both ways. I mean, to me, what's thinking about this idea of thinking about your story as different. Oh, illuminated. I like this. We got a lot of synonyms coming. And it's what you have now is your own story, right? Your own relationship with this place, very much like you have a lot of context there. You have concretized, cemented. Those are good words. That actually is really, really nice. And I think that thinking about it as your own story is so much more powerful because it's yours to write in a way.
I totally agree. And I think again, it was never something that was emphasized in my family, Holocaust history. So I think there's like a real like surprise in the best possible sense and like happiness within my family that we now have something to hold on to. And it's like, again, I never really got closer to my grandfather through all this, but yet there's something really meaningful in articulating that ignorance. And then there's just this whole Michigas with the treasure hunters and Abraham Kaiser, and like it's like what a rich story to have.
I like the part, you know, your family sort of found an old, what was it, like slides in the basement somewhere.
Yeah, we're not a particularly sentimental family, and so those family videos, I don't know if they've ever been watched. They were old Super 8s hanging out in the basement that, you know, when I was doing this for a few years already, they're like, hey, we have these videos, and I went and had them digitized, and they were just family videos, but family videos when you're, and it's your family, um, they're like, it's like time travel. I mean, they're really something really amazing.
And you got to see sort of footage of your grandfather, and I think it's the kind of thing where your family wouldn't have remembered that they had that in the basement or the attic had you not sort of gotten them in that direction. So I do think there's a really interesting,
Yeah.
I don't know if it's a sea change, but it's something cracked open in your family.
Yeah, I think there's like sort of, a lot of us do it in like smaller scale of sort of, we take a history and we sort of open it back up. And so we know a lot of things, but yet, you know, your knowledge probably isn't all that accurate. And so at a certain point, sometimes we choose to dig into our stories, and you don't know what's going to happen, but you guarantee it's going to get richer and like weirder and stranger and less familiar, not more familiar. And so you're right. Yes, like I don't, those videos probably, I certainly never would have asked for them. I might have been like less compelled to watch them had I not been like neck deep in this work. But yeah.
So we have a bunch of questions coming in. I'm going to switch over to them. Some of them are very specific and logistic. Some of them are more, I don't know, philosophical. But so someone wants to know how you figured out that you were in fact related to Abraham, the guy who kept this diary of his slave labor that was part of the
Sure. So
tunnels.
when I bought his diary, when it, you know, it's a published book, I bought it at the gift shop at one of the tunnels. It sold all over the place. And so basically they had a preface, and the preface was like a work of real scholarship done by the Museum of Gross Rosen. But again, it was in Polish. I don't speak Polish. So I Google translated it with my phone, like that night. And I found out who his parents were. And Abraham's father was named Fivish. And then I had all the sort of records of all the Kaisers in the region, sort of anything that popped up as a death certificate, a marriage certificate, a birth record. I had all that on a spreadsheet. And so what I was able to do, and I had never done this before because I never really had to, was I took my great grandfather, Moshe Kaiser, and I looked for everyone else who had the same parents. And so what I was able to do is figure out all of Moshe's siblings. So I figured out Moshe's parents with David and Esther. And David and Esther had 4 children that I could find, maybe more. And I found their marriage records. And then one of them was Fivish. And so they were first cousins.
That is just truly, truly, I don't know, I mean, I don't even know, what is the word for what that is?
We could ask the chat.
Yeah, guys, can you give us synonyms for what you think this is when you find out about a famous, very, very famous former concentration camp inmate who wrote a memoir that you end up being related to. So yeah, we're accepting those submissions in the chat. Bashert, that's a good one. I was gonna say Karma, like, yeah, it's Bashert. I think that's a good one. We have a great, very specific question from someone whose family was also from Sosnowiec, and they want to know, what was the building? And it's a very complicated question, I know. It's not as simple as it seems.
Well, the building I had originally thought it was it's an apartment building. It's like 4 stories tall, probably like 10, maybe 15 units. The building has a remarkable history, actually. So during communist times, it was designated by the government as housing for people who worked at the theater. So there's like a renowned provincial theater just around the block. And so everyone who lived there for years and years and years was a director, an actor, a costumer, admin. And it was a place where everyone knew each other, and they had just like remarkable stories, like how the building is like one larger family. To these days, it's no longer only theater people, but most people in the building still have roots in the theater. So you have like the grandson of the director, and it's still like everyone really knows each other. The building, it actually is down the block. It's a corner building, 3 stories. On the ground floor is a pharmacy, and the top 2 floors are residences.
Someone's offering us the word fortuitous, which I really, really like.
Definitely fortuitous, yeah.
So, okay, let's see. So someone wants to know about the killer, about your attorney. How did you find the killer?
Sure.
You're like, what's the story? Are you? And then they're also asking, are you fluent in Polish? And was Kaiser your family's Polish name?
Oh, great questions. I sort of, when I got those documents from my father, I was like, oh, I need a lawyer. And so there was a guy, this Hasidic guy, like pretty much a macher in Krakow, who's like just knew a lot of people. And I was like, hey, in the book, I call him Yechiel. I was like, Yechiel, I need a lawyer. He's like, I know just the one. And he's like, the killer. And so that's how I got connected to the killer. I didn't do a lot of legal research. I am not fluent in Polish. It's one of the greatest lacks of foresight. I had no idea I'd be spending this much time there. If I had, I definitely would have studied. My Polish is non-existent. So everywhere I've gone, I've used a translator, unless the person I'm speaking to speaks English. And then Kaiser was the Polish name, but it was spelled with Polish, like phonetic, like Kajzer. And so I actually had to provide documentation that my family name was changed from Kajzer to Kaiser.
So we're also getting synchronicity and serendipity. So really, this is great. Someone wants to know more about your grandfather. This is a tough one, but why did you not know what happened to him, and what did happen to him after the war?
So my grandfather died in 77, and so I was not born yet. And he died when my father was in his early 20s. And so I didn't know him, for that simple reason. Why did I not know about him? It was just like there was no real way, he was never really described to me. No memories of him were passed down, and he never spoke about his wartime experience. So the very few details I've been able to get are from documents I found in my house of his applications to the German government for medical assistance after the war. And so there he just sort of listed like bullet point, like what camps he had been in, but like no, I had nothing. And then what happened after the war, this part, I mean, I know the basic outline. So he survived the war. He moved to Munich. He married my grandmother. They stayed there for a few years, then moved to New York, and then in the early 60s moved to Toronto.
So someone is confirming that the standard practice in Poland is to return Jewish communal property, but not private property, and that the case of Jews who have received any sort of restitution for privately owned property has been few and far between in Poland. And I would love for you to just like explain that a little bit more. We're hearing from a lot of people who have this experience in Germany where it's sort of different. Yeah. So why is Poland distinct in this way?
So let me reemphasize that there's restitution, where in restitution, it legally is reclaiming property that had been taken. And so that would be, was it nationalized, or there's a new owner that you're trying to displace. My case is not a restitution case. My case is a relatively more straightforward inheritance claim. So my thing is like, my great grandfather owned the building. He still owns the building. Therefore, his heirs now own the building. Poland does not have any restitution law. Most of the other countries do, and they could be more or less difficult to sort of exercise. But Poland, yeah, if a property was taken, as long as it's not Jewish communal property, it's very difficult to get back.
So we have a question from someone who has already read the book, who has not just heard about it tonight and is going to buy it. They have already purchased and read it. So Nat wants to know, I mean, the book ends in an interesting way. Sorry, there's something happening outside. The book ends in an interesting way. Will you tell us about the epilogue and why you chose to end the book with someone else's story?
Yeah, so basically the epilogue was a story that happened to me when I was in Krakow. One of the last times I was there, I met a guy, in the book I call him Steve, and Steve had this like really remarkable tale that his father-in-law had hid 10 golden eggs, and he was in Poland for the first time, and he had a map of where they were, and things, Stephanie, you've been there, weird things happen when you're in Krakow. And so we ended up going searching for the eggs together, and we sort of went to the place. It was a small house in Benjin, which is again right next to Sosnowiec. And I had this kind of opportunity of literally removing bricks in a woman's attic, searching for these 10 golden eggs. Why did I end it like that? I can't answer that and satisfyingly, but like it felt right. It had this feeling of this like literal treasure, and it wasn't my story, and that sort of was felt freeing. And I don't if it just it like had like this sort of emotional resonance. I never planned that, but it just like it had. I don't know. I don't know. It's one of those weird things. It's just like it felt like it fit.
And the book ends on a true cliffhanger because you pull away the final brick and we do not know what it is that you see. And it's like, will you ever tell us what you saw there?
Yeah, I'm waiting for Steve's family to read the book. So Steve read the chapter before it was submitted. It's a story that in his family is guarded very, very closely. They're very protective of the story, but a lot of people are asking, and so I'm gonna wait for permission from Steve either way.
And follow up, and then I think we'll sort of wrap things up. Someone, Nat again wants to know, I mean, did that epilogue give you the kind of resolution that you felt was missing from your, these are good questions, Nat, you should be leading this, that you felt were missing from your own story, that neat, tidy ending where you pull away the final brick and your answer definitively, yes, these are here, no, these are not here?
It's a good question. Sort of, in a way, it's sort of like indulging the adventure. Also, I think there's like this strain of adventure in the story that I never really let myself or the reader indulge in. Like everything's more complicated, everything's trickier, everything's like more morally tenuous. But with this story, I was like, here it is. Like here's just like an unmediated adventure treasure, like in an attic. I want to say I'm getting some negative reactions to it too. I'm getting some people have read the book who are upset about this, and I understand that. They're like, you're cheapening things by like having it be this adventure-y. I didn't intend to make it adventure-y. It's just like that. It's what happened. Um, so that's an interesting question. Again, maybe I'd like if readers took that from that, I'd like that. That'd be very gratifying.
Well, what I took from it, I mean, we've already gone through this book, several hundred pages with you, of you learning the system, being stymied by the system, kind of understanding the system, getting pulled on this treasure hunt. And it all sort of comes together with another person like you who is doing this memory tourism, who has the hand-drawn map from the father-in-law who says here, and we were all, you know, even your grandfather had said after the war, right? Like that they hid jewelry in the walls of the building. So
Yeah.
this idea is so metaphorical, but also very real in this case. And so I like that you were like, don't like do this, don't do this. I can
Yeah.
help. You're sort of like an old hand by the end of it.
It's so common. It's just like it's kind of remarkable like how many people have this kind of story in their family. I don't think so many people have stories of finding treasure, but so many people, and not just Jews, like people who have a displaced person narrative in their family story, have like a sort of either material or totemic object that was left behind, that they are yearning for. And there was something like the golden eggs are just like, can you get more? Like it's just like the actual object is just like you can't get more treasury, like material sentiment. It's crazy. And so I had a building, which is something you can't find exactly. And Steve had these golden eggs.
It's interesting because we're all sort of going back to find something, right? But these are just much more explicit things you're looking for.
Yeah, it does. It concretizes the metaphor, but it doesn't get undermine the metaphor either. It sort of like builds on top of it, and so yeah, I just found it to be like such a compelling thing that really like rhymes with my story.
Well, we hope that everyone here reads your story. The book is Plunder, a memoir of family property and Nazi treasure. I've marked all the good pages, so if you want to, you can email me and I'll tell you what they are. Menachem Kaiser, thank you so much for being
Sure.
with us here tonight.
I'll add one quick thing is that
Oh, yeah.
if anyone wants to get in touch with me directly, if they have like more specific questions or looking for resources, please email me at plunder.booktalk@gmail.com. I think Gia could put it in the chat. Yeah, if you're looking for sort of, if I want to hear your stories, I'd like to, if you need help with stuff or to get pointed in the right direction, yeah, I'd love to hear.
Thank you. All right, Gia, take us home.
Thank you, everyone, for joining us this evening. And thank you, Menachem and Stephanie. It was a very interesting talk. And Menachem, I missed the email address when I was going to come back on. So if you want to put that in the chat now so we can
Sure.
leave everyone with that. I'm so sorry. Or you can repeat it. I'll put it in.
Menachem, someone's saying you are quite the mensch.
That's the highest, where I come from, that's the highest compliment.
And we know where you come from because we've read the book.
Okay, thank you, everyone. Good night.
Wait, did I just send it to all panelists or everyone?
Just
Oh,
panelists, everyone didn't get
okay.
it.
I will do this right now.
Okay, thank you so much, Gia.
Okay, you're all set. I'll give everyone a second to take a look at that. And thank you very much. Once again, it's plunder.booktalk@gmail.com. Have a good night, everyone.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you.